The Revelation Explained by F. G. Smith, Chapter 9, Part 2. We begin with the Book of Revelation, Chapter 9, verses 12 through 21. One woe is past, and behold, there come two woes more hereafter. Note this announcement that one woe is past, meaning that the period of 150 years during which the Saracens were to continue their conquests has ended, serves an important purpose in enabling us to fix the chronology of the events described. It proves that they succeed each other. Continuing with verse 13. And the sixth angel sounded, and I heard a voice from the four horns of the golden altar which is before God, saying to the sixth angel which had the trumpet, Loose the four angels which are bound in the great river Euphrates. And the four angels were loosed, which were prepared for an hour, and a day, and a month, and a year, for to slay the third part of men. And the number of the army of the horsemen were 200,000. And I heard the number of them. And thus I saw the horses in the vision, and them that sat on them, having breastplates of fire, and of jacinth, and brimstone, and the heads of the horses were as the heads of lions, and out of their mouths issued fire, and smoke, and brimstone. By these three was the third part of men killed, by the fire, and by the smoke, and by the brimstone which issued out of their mouths. For their power is in their mouth, and in their tails. For their tails were like unto serpents, and had heads, and with them they do hurt. And the rest of the men which were not killed by these plagues, yet repented not of the works of their hands, that they should not worship devils, and idols of gold, and silver, and brass, and stone, and of wood, which neither can see, nor hear, nor walk. Neither repented they of their murders, nor of their sorceries, nor of their fornication, nor of their thefts. Continuing now with the commentary. At the sounding of the sixth trumpet, or the second woe trumpet, a voice is heard from the four horns, or all the horns of the golden altar. This probably denotes that the very same altar where incense was offered up to God with the prayers of all saints was now crying out to him for vengeance upon an apostate church. That church had reached the summit of apostasy and iniquity. The Virgin Mary, the saints, and thousands of idols in the form of miserable relics being worshipped more than God. Because of these abominable idolatries, a voice is heard crying from the golden altar for the avenging judgments of heaven, which were the loosing of the four angels bound in the river Euphrates. The symbols of this vision are also of peculiar character and drawn from different departments. We have four angels bound in the Euphrates, an immense army of horsemen, then a large number of horses with heads as of lions, and fire, smoke, and brimstone issuing from their mouths. The horses thus particularly described are evidently intended to have a definite symbolical signification, and, being objects of nature, they would indicate a political or military power. The horsemen, being objects from human life, would point us to some religious body, while the angels signify the leaders that have control of these agencies. their being commissioned, quote, to slay the third part of men, end quote, show that they will overthrow some of the established institutions of society. We are to look, therefore, for some politico-religious power that should invade and overthrow the empire. We are, of course, directed to the Eastern Empire, for the Western division was subverted under the symbols of the first 4 trumpets. With these specifications before us, we shall have no difficulty in identifying the power intended: the Turkish or Ottoman Empire. Its agreement with the symbolic representation of the vision will be manifest from a statement of the facts of history. Quote, the Turks were of Tartar or Scythian origin, from the northern regions of Asia, whence also the Huns hived upon Europe during the 4th and 5th centuries. The latter passed to the north of the Black Sea from Russia, and swept the regions of the Danube and the Rhine. The Turks, passing to the east of the Seine, fell upon the empire from that quarter. They took possession of Armenia Major in the 9th century, where they increased and, in the space of 200 years, became a formidable power, being at the end of this period combined into 4 sultanies, the heads of which were at Baghdad, Damascus, Aleppo, and Iconium. The first of these was erected in AD 1055, the next 2 in AD 1079, and the last in AD 1080, all of them within 25 years, and the last 3 within 2. These 4 sultanies are doubtless signified by the 4 angels that were bound in the river Euphrates. The Euphrates here is employed as a symbol not of the Turks themselves, for the horsemen are their symbol, as we shall see, but of the binding of the angels. The use of this word as a symbol is derived from a fact of history, being the object, according to Herodotus, that kept Cyrus back from entering the city of Babylon. While the Persian monarch surrounded the city of that ancient metropolis of Babylonian Empire with his army, he was held in restraint by the river Euphrates, and it was not until he had diverted its waters into an artificial channel that he gained an entrance. So also, these sultanies, or leaders of the Turks, were held under restraint, as if bound by the river Euphrates, until the time appointed for them to go forth on their mission of conquest. Different causes held them back. For a long time they were involved in fierce and almost continuous wars with the neighboring Tartar tribes on the east and the north, and at the same time the Crusaders of Europe were carrying on a determined war with the Saracen for the possession of the Holy Land. For 2 centuries the armies of Christendom poured into Syria and Palestine to recover from the hands of the infidels, as they were called, the holy sepulchre of the country that gave birth to Christianity. But when Europe finally abandoned the project, then went forth the command to loose the 4 angels, quote, which were prepared for an hour and a day and a month and a year, for to slay the third part of man, end quote. To kill men symbolically, I have already shown, signifies the destruction either of an empire as a political body or of the church, that is, the so-called church, as a religious body. The locusts under the 5th trumpet were to do neither, but the symbolic characters of this vision are, quote, to slay the third part of men, end quote, by which is set forth the fall and subjugation of the Eastern Empire and Church, just as, under the fifth trumpet, the fall of the Western Empire was described by the darkening of a third part of the sun, moon, and stars. Before considering the time prophecy in this vision, we will pass on to notice a few particulars respecting the horses and their riders. The horsemen possessed breastplates of fire, jacinth, and brimstone, while out of the mouths of the horses proceeded fire, smoke, and brimstone. There is evidently a special design in distinguishing between the horses and their riders, these symbols being drawn from different sources, the former from the natural world and the latter from human life, point out the two characteristics of the Turks as a politico-religious power. The symbolic description of the two is almost identical. The horsemen had breastplates of fire, jacinth, which is purplish or reddish in hue, and brimstone. This describes the character of the Turks as a religious system. Out of the horses' mouths proceeded fire, smoke, and brimstone, which represents the Muslims as a political power. The only difference is that the smoke is substituted for the jacinth, but they very nearly agree in color. We are thus brought to the conclusion that the political and the religious power of the Turks is in harmony and agreement with each other, united in the closest manner possible, like a horse and its rider, and both animated by the same spirit. That spirit is perhaps their fierce, fanatical, aggressive, intolerant character. The tails of the horses were like serpents with heads, their power being in their mouth and in their tails, the one a lion, the other a serpent. It was by the fire, the smoke, and the brimstone that came from their lion heads that the third part of men was killed, or their conquests were made. Then, with their serpent-like tails, they would torment or hurt all those who would not adopt the Muslim faith, being in this respect like the scorpion locusts. Their lion heads would denote their invincible strength and courage, and their serpent tails the tormenting sting inflicted upon those whom they subdued, but who would not accept their religion. It is not said that the riders were the direct agents of destruction, not the Muslim faith as a religion, but it was the horses that accomplished the deadly work, the Ottomans as a political body. This was the power that extended conquests and established their empire, although it was accompanied by the religious system working in perfect harmony. It is said that, quote, the rest of men which were not killed by these plagues, end quote, repented not. This expression doubtless signifies the Western or Latin Church. They saw these judgments of the Euphratean horsemen on the Eastern Empire and the triumph of the Muslim sword and faith. The woe fell as a judgment upon the Eastern Church. Still, they continued as before in their abominable idolatries, by which is probably meant their worship of the Virgin Mary, saints, relics, and images. There was no reformation. Error, superstition, and ecclesiastical usurpation prevailed as before. The Turks obtained their first victory over the Christians of the Eastern or Greek Empire in AD 1281. Within 10 years, the Latins who inhabited Palestine were entirely overthrown. This is referenced in Gibbon's work, Volume 6, page 47. And the way was now clear for Turkish aggression against the Greek Empire. Before the end of the century, the four sultanies mentioned were combined into one consolidated empire under Osman. This name was corrupted by Europeans into Ottoman, and from him took the name which it still retains, the Ottoman Empire. From the time they were let loose, the Turks continued their aggressions until AD 1453, when Constantinople fell before their victorious arms, and the Eastern Empire, with the last of the Constantines, sunk to rise no more. Quote, "The Turkish sword and the religion of the Koran were enthroned in the Christian metropolis of the Roman emperors, and the proud Muslim had the Christian dog completely under his foot." End quote. The Ottoman power, however, continued to grow and make new conquests until the year AD 1672, when they conducted a successful campaign against Poland, in which 48 towns and villages were ceded to the Sultan, with promise of an annual tribute of 220,000 ducats. See Encyclopedia Britannica, article Turkey. This was the last victory they ever gained wherein the Ottoman Empire obtained any advantage. A little later they marched against Vienna, but sustained a miserable defeat. Quote, "Venice and Russia now declared war against Turkey. Misfortune followed misfortune. City after city was rent away from the empire. The Austrians were in possession of almost the whole of Hungary, the Italians of almost all the Morea." End quote. From Encyclopedia Britannica, article Turkey. So the power of the Ottomans to extend their conquests and to add to their empire ended with the victory over the Poles in AD 1672. This fact is even admitted by Demetrius Cantemir, Prince of Moldavia, one of their historians, in the following language. Quote, "This was the last victory by which any advantage accrued to the Ottoman state, or any city or province was annexed to the ancient bounds of the empire." End quote. In accordance with this statement, the same historian entitles the first part of his history up to the victory over the Poles in 1672, the history of the growth of the Ottoman Empire, and the remaining portion, the decay of the Ottoman Empire. Calculating now the time during which these horsemen were prepared to extend their conquests, quote, "an hour and a day and a month and a year," end quote, we find, according to prophetic or symbolic time, 30 days in a month, 360 in a year, that it signifies 391 years and 15 days. This is exactly the period of time that elapsed between their first victory in AD 1281 and their last conquest in AD 1672. I cannot verify the 15 days because no history at my command states the exact days of the month on which these victories occurred. One more point of importance must be considered before we conclude this chapter, and that is the continuance of the Ottoman power. The first, or Saracen woe, had power to torment men 5 months, or 150 years, during which time they continued their ravages. The second woe began when the command was given to loose the 4 angels, or the beginning of the Ottoman conquest, an hour and a day and a month and a year, or 391 years, marked the time during which they were prepared to extend their conquests. But it is not stated that the woe itself or the Ottoman power would then cease, for it is not represented as ending until after the death and resurrection of the witnesses from chapter 11, verse 14, immediately following which the coming of Christ and the general judgment, or the third woe, is described in verses 15 through 18. The Turkish power has made no advance for centuries, but has been on the decline, yet it will endure for its allotted time. It furnishes us a waymark by which we can determine our position along the pathway of time. For when it falls, we may rest assured that the coming of Christ is imminent. For nearly 2 centuries, it has been the wonder of civilized nations how that corrupt, tyrannical government, which has been described as a despotism tempered by assassination, could exist in the increased light and onward advance of modern civilization. Concerning its position in Europe, Judson, in his recent History of Europe in the 19th century, says, quote, "The Turkish Empire has been an element of unrest in Europe. It has long been plain to all that it is not permanent. It has taken no root. The Turks are merely encamped in Europe, and it is merely a question of time when the last of them must return across the Bosphorus." End quote, from page 269-270. But Turkey will continue to hold this territory of the old Greek Empire until the time appointed by the Father for her overthrow. The nations of Europe have often conspired for her overthrow. This is what is known as the Great Eastern Question, which has been described by one writer as, quote, "the expulsion of the Turk from Europe and the scramble for his territory," end quote. But it has not yet been accomplished, for the very reason, doubtless, that it could not take place before the resurrection of the witnesses, of which we will speak later. Judson thus continues his account of the matter. Quote, "As soon as this idea was realized, that Turkish power in Europe must fall by the Western nations, in place of the dread of the Turk, which had so long been part and parcel of European thinking, the question of the disposal to be made of the Turkish possessions became matter of live interest. And this is the Eastern question. The Greek Empire vanished forever when the last Constantine fell in 1453. The only problem is one of partition, and the heart of it all is the disposal to be made of Constantinople. That imperial city is a site that, in strong hands, means power and wealth. What shall become of it? Russia early formed designs of conquest. The Empress Catherine had a grand scheme for a restoration of the Greek Empire under a Russian prince. Alexander I, at Tilsit, planned a partition of the Ottoman Empire with Napoleon, but the latter declined to see Constantinople in Russian hands. "Constantinople," said he, "is the empire of the world." In 1844, Nicholas visited England and made guarded suggestions to the Prime Minister about the Turkish lands. The Ottoman Empire, said he, was a sick man nearly at the last extremity. England declined to plan for a share of the inheritance, and nothing was done. In 1853, Nicholas resumed the subject with the British ambassador at St. Petersburg. The sick man, he now held, was at the point of death. But again England declined, and indeed the next year went to war with Russia to save the sick man from a premature end at the hands of the would-be administrator of the estate. Another power doubly interested in the future of the Turkish dominions is Austria. That empire has been the traditional enemy of the Turk, and at the end of the 17th century was the actual bulwark of Europe against Mohammedan conquest. When the tide of war rolled the other way, Austria was ready to share in the spoils. Twice, near the end of the 18th century, was an alliance made between Russia and Austria for the partition of Turkey. Thus, we find that these designs of nations for the overthrow of Turkey have so far been overruled, for God will not allow that power to come to a premature end. This concludes chapter 9.